Good evening and welcome to another podcast episode from the Culture, Society and Security team at ITSS Verona. Today we will be speaking with three incredible women who have authored a book detailing the collective experience of Peruvians toward Chinese heritage and other marginalized ethnic groups. The book, Más allá del Bicentenario, Tareas, Pendientes, Beyond Bicentennial Pending Tasks, will be published by Universidad del Pacifico, one of the leading academic institutions in Peru, in late January 2022. So my name is Sofia Staderini and my colleague is Leigh Dawson. Together we will be speaking with Mariela Noles Cotito, Professor of Political Science, Discrimination and Public Policy at the Universidad del Pacifico, Peru, and editor of the book Más allá del Bicentenario, Tareas Pendientes. Alexandra Arana Blas, PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh and author of the chapter Sensibilidades y Subjetividades, and Julia Hodgins, master candidate at King's College London, co-author of the chapter El Perú a Través de Nuestros Ojos, and our valued colleague and member of the ITSS Verona Culture, Society and Security team. So thank you very much for being here today with us. As a first introductory question, I would like to ask you to briefly define and outline what exactly the Tusan identity is, and how it appealed to the particular historical context of this new alterity.
Mariela, would you like to start?
Oh, I definitely think that speaking of the Dusan identity is something that probably Julia and Alexandra is something that you're way more informed about that to talk about.
Sure. Well, the Tusan identity, like many minorities in Peru, has undergone many struggles historically. The center of these struggles have been that initially, the first time we came to Peru, we, like Tusanes, we came from China, was to work in farms and in large factories. And for reasons that we don't know exactly, many of our last names, our history was white, the workers that came to Peru, their last names were forcefully changed. And that condition, leaving behind not only your family and your daily life, but your history. At this point, many of the Tusans, we don't know exactly where we come from. We don't have, our grandparents have not passed on us our history. And that is a big break. Apparently, it's a simple thing, but it's a big break in your building of your identity as a person and as a collective. And that creates not only problems for you to feel yourself, but also creates a hard, as unsurmountable distance with other groups. So it breaks the society in a word. And that, well, we can see all over the planet. What would that cause? And in Peru in particular, that caused that Chinese descendants or Chinese people who immigrate was seen in a different way, right? You other the others. You make the others not only different, but distant. So that gap then becomes the reason in the fertile territory for aggressions, for discriminations, for stereotypes that are profoundly hurtful to the interaction of human beings, creates economic gaps, and structural violence. We have to say it strictly clear. This structural violence, this pattern has happened not only to Tusanes, has happened, of course, to Afro-descendants first than anybody, with the trade slavery planetary, and then to other ethnias. Not only Peru everywhere, but it happened to us too, and has not been collected by history. And this was one of the driving ideas on our chapters.
Another thing to take into account in order to understand the Tusan identity is that it's not only one identity. When we talk about Tusan, it's a big community. It's communities, in fact, because there is a lot of migration from different parts of China, north, south, east, west, different provinces. For example, the main one at the beginning of the 20th century was from Canton, the south, but when we see later in the 20th century, maybe the most recent one, it's from the north. So they have different costumes. So that's why when we talk about Tusan identity, we also have to take into account in which moment of Peruvian history these communities went to that country. Yeah, so that's another factor that we have to take into account. And that's why Tusan identity is very, very complex to understand.
That's great. I mean, and noting that context, it kind of dovetails really nicely into the question that I had, and that was, I mean, according to the most recent Peruvian census, just more than 14,000 people identified as Chinese Peruvians or Tusan. Now, this is down from in excess of about 100,000 about 100 years prior. So that's a fairly sharp decline. What do you think are some of the contributing factors to, I guess, the Tusan identity, just down to, to just 14,000 people across Peru?
Well, numbers are unclear, right? This publication you quote, this mentioned that number. In our knowledge, based on the calculations from Chinese Heritage Association, 5 to 10% might be Tusan in Peru. However, these groups, the Chinese Heritage Association, they count for their affiliation and their calculations, their estimation. There is not a close number or even a, let's say, a portion, right? Also, they count for the fulfill of belonging characteristics they consider. So if you look Chinese, if you have a last name, and if you know you can, then they count you. If you don't, you won't be counted. And the situation, the reality is that many Tusan Chinese who came to Peru, they mix with the local population. So these groups, these descendants have been invisibilized by society, formal mainstream, and by the Chinese heritage organizations. And intentionally, that was not necessarily done in a, they just felt that, well, they don't look Chinese, they don't have the last name, maybe they're not, right? So when you create social gaps, this is what happened. People start disengaging. People start dividing each other, right? So many Tusanes also, like I said, had the roots wiped away with the change of last names. And this is also the important thing. We don't have a category in the census for the different ethnicities in Peru and the different groups within those ethnicities. In the census 2017, which is the most recent one, for the first time, a self-identifying ethnic category was used, a question was used, but it does not contemplate anyone that comes from an Asia background. It contemplates Afro-descendant, white, indigenous, the different indigenous from Peru, and the jungle and the Andes, and uses the category other, and you could specify Chino, Chinese, Tusan, Han, Nikkei, which is Japanese, or other. So, however, it's the first effort. So many organizations of Chinese groups, not the traditional, but the new groups of Chinese heritage, we had the common cause to start these discussions in the Ministry of Culture and with the statistical organization to start including categories and ways to map the population. Alexandra?
Yeah, well, I wrote my response because it's something a little big and maybe I got a little confused. So yeah, some factors we have to acknowledge in order to understand the decreasing number of self-identified Chinese Peruvians is how Peruvian society construct the notion of the mestizo. It was based on the idea of the union between criollo, it means European Spanish descendant, and indigenous people. The official history erasure the story of migration and the participation of other communities. That is why there is a lack of identification for many Peruvians with Chinese ancestors. Also, we have to take into account that some of the Chinese migration was temporal. I mean, some Chinese went to Peru for a period of time to make money and they returned to China, or in some cases to Hong Kong with their families. I would say that the problem here is that Chinese descendants and general Asian descendants are seen in Peru and in other countries such as the United States as a liminal figure. It means not native, but they are also not foreigner. They also are not inside that dichotomy over some societies were built, such as the whites and black in the case of the United States, or whites and indigenous people, as in the case of Latin America. That is why it's difficult for Chinese descendants to build their identity, more if they don't participate in the hegemonic institutions of their community, such as the Beneficencia China or the Centro Cultural Peruano-Chino.
Thank you very much. So in your paper, you discuss...
Mariela wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to, no, it's okay. I just wanted to add something because I completely agree with Julia and Alexandra. How I would characterize it is that mestizaje and the strive for the liquidation of all racialized markers that have the potential to lower status or social capital are precisely a factor to consider when we think about the decline of Tusanes and of all racialized groups in the country. We are actually not encouraged to identify ourselves as part of a racialized or ethnic groups, where in fact, talking about race in our country is still deemed sometimes as separatist. So we still have a long way to go in the realm of cultural affirmation, not only externally, but also internally, to speak to the point that Alexandra was making recently.
Okay, thank you. So now, in your paper, you discuss racialization and otherness dynamics, as well as the devastating consequence that this pattern have had on Peru's Tusan people. Could you please discuss the country's social fragmentation as a result of this process, as well as the violence experienced by minorities in Peru?
Wow, that's going to be hard for me, but we're going to make it to the main points. The racialization, as we were saying, create distance between people, and that is fertile ground for aggression. One of the typical things is that Chinese, we are put in different stereotypes. First of all, there is a general, how can I say, a general frame, how Chinese you are. And if you are Chinese, you have to know math, you have to be good at business. People mocks you and talks you in mocking Chinese. Now. And there are, in the TV, there are TV shows making fun of the stereotype, crudely, we will say raw, very raw, and even mixing Japanese. I mean, the fact that all the Asians are called Chino may not be as bad as making fun of all these, or if you want to make fun of Fujimori, you make fun of a Chinese person. So it's not even appropriate because he's from Japanese origin, not Peruvian. So this aggression open in media and in statements of the daily life. One of the things we discovered in the focus group was that all the attendants mentioned that yeah, sometimes my friends tease me, but I know they in the very bottom they like me. So we trade a microaggression with acceptance. Okay, yeah, if you I'm gonna pass you if you are aggressive with me, as long as you're my friend and you sort of treat me in other moments as we are equal. So this is daily, and while looks, well, it's not really a big issue, boys will always be boys, people will always be people, is more pernicious than we think, because there is a strong imposter syndrome in all the attendants of the focus group, even in me, that was the conductor, I feel it too, right? And you can project it to other people, other groups and other people. And even the attendants were bringing up experience of other people they knew in the same line with the same pattern. So this is one of the structural violence that minorities undergo in our country in a daily basis. That's why we were saying earlier that the panorama with the changes in the cabinet can make it look even somber when the suffering of people is a little bit taken off, minimized, taken to the side as a matter that you need to learn to deal in private. Well, no, it's not private. It's out there everywhere to everybody daily. That makes it a pattern and that makes it an issue that has to be looked at policy level. And this is one of the drivers in our chapters, and I'm sure it's in the book too. And to make it, to cut it to the bone, those are the main patterns I found in the focus group.
If I can add just a little bit to open the playing field before Alexandra, I think that's a very interesting question, because what we have in Peru is the social fragmentation or inequality based on race or skin color is second nature to the Peruvian society today. And we can actually trace it back to the establishment of the colonial rule with the separation between the Republic of the Spaniards and the Indian Republic, right? These were two separate legal regimes that operated as a mechanism of distinction between the peoples that inhabited the country at the time. And we do not have said regime today, but we live with its legacy and its consequences for everybody that is living in Peru at this time today. The Republic of Peru was not founded as a country of equals, and the notion of equality before the law is then, even today, a fallacy for us. Social capital and social standing is still a privilege reserved for white individuals and those resembling and performing whiteness, right? Because whiteness is still the aspiration, even in a country where the great majority of peoples is not white. So that is, just wanted to add a little bit more to the framework that Julia was presenting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Mariela. To add some ideas to what Julia said, well, in Peru, there is an hegemonic idea of what is a Chinese descendant. The more Asian you look for Peruvian, the most probably to racialize you and interact with you with stereotypes, as Julia said. We also have to take into account that in Peru, society put in the same bag to all Asian communities, and they call all of them Chino, the Spanish for Chinese. They call Chino to Japanese descendants, sometimes maybe to Korean descendants. And when you don't look Chinese, but you try to make visible your identity, talking to other people about it, they sometimes racialize you and reduce you to Oriental stereotypes, such as the food, dragon, and the martial arts imaginary. It's a very complicated situation, not only for Chinese descendants, whose ancestors are all from China, but also there is a double marginalization for Chinese descendants who have an identity cross with other origins. When you are indigenous, when you are mixed with Spanish descendants and like that. So yeah. For us, mixed race Chinese descendant, and when I mean by us, well, you, Julia, it's an example, me is another example. We are racialized by Peruvians, but we are also viewed as with suspicion we are even pushed away by Chinese communities. The problem of the otherness of the Chinese community in Peru can be reflected in the last census, where we were not considered as community who conform the Peruvian culture and territory. The census had listed, for example, the Quechua and Aymara community, but not the Chinese or the Japanese community. Well, my chapter was about arts and literature, so I'm going to talk more about the otherness in these aspects. So the problem of the otherness is also reflected in Peruvian arts and literature. We have the case of Nilton Ma, who has some poems where he talks about the segregation and stigmatization based on his physical appearance and how his face and first surname make invisible for others his indigenous ancestry, and produces a reduction of his identity as only Chinese descendant, even though in reality he has more connection with his indigenous ancestry than the Chinese one. Another example, and maybe Julia, could you please put the images I sent you to WhatsApp? Okay, another example we have is the visual art of Bianca Coptam, who grew up in the Chinese community and studied in a Chinese Peruvian school, and her parents also talk Chinese. In other words, she was mainly socialized in the Tusan or Chinese Peruvian community. In her comics that we are going to see just right now, yeah, in her comic, yeah. Okay, so she sent for the paper 2 comics. This is the first one, and maybe later you show Julia the next one. In her comics, she wants to rescue not only material objects that reflect her culture, such as the food and the importance of certain traditions, but also tries to rescue Cantonese words, the original language of most of our Chinese ancestors, and denounce the racialization and marginalization that Chinese descendants suffer every day. And that's the topic of this same comic right now. We can see a girl who is going to school and has what we call a scarapella. Sorry, I don't know the name in English, but it's like something you put near your heart, your chest in July, that it's the month of our, where we celebrate our country. And yeah, she's racialized when she's in the streets. The people say, te encantará, that it's a pejorative way to imitate how Chinese descendants talk. Yeah. Yeah, we can see at the end that the girl is feeling sad because even though she knows she's Peruvian, she's not seen like that for the others. So it's interesting because she usually has a little girl as the protagonist of her comics, she usually uses very cute images with which we can see the transgression potential behind the concept of cuteness and innocence, something very similar to the concept of Japanese kawaii. And its reference that talking with her comes from, and I think that it's not free, this reference to the kawaii, to the cuteness, this cute style, because she's part of a generation who consume a lot of anime and manga. And yeah, the idea of cuteness is very, very inside my generation. So I think that this is something that we should take into account when we analyze the art of this artist of Bianca Coctam. Yeah, maybe you can show Julia the other image. Yeah, well, this is another art that she sent to us for the paper. We can see how she reflect what she think about what is being a Chinese descendant in Peru. We don't have only one type of face. We are very different. So that's what she wanted to reflect in her art. Yeah, that's one of the authors we saw in the paper. The other one, for example, finally, we have the case of the theater of Caro Black Tam, whose identities intersect by their sexuality, because they are part of the LGBT community. Thus, even though they don't talk directly about Chinese communities in their work, they address otherness and how LGBT communities are ignored by the government and its politics.
Thank you very much. And now for taking this further, what in your opinion are the consequences of constructing such social and political hierarchies within a state or a nation and its citizen securities?
Well, I would start saying that what we raise the intense social rivalization and even polarization of the relations in the society. So not only the society is polarized, but the interactions end up in a polarization alley, right? Systemic racism, as we said, structural violence, because the racist and discriminative attitudes that we mentioned become normalized and invisible. It's part of the construction of the whole thing, right? This structural violence is perpetuated in a way that minimizes, protects, conceals the violence, not only the verbal or the social violence, but the direct violence. There has been attacks and even sad to say. There's a story of an avenue in Lima where all Chinese used to live that was burned down, just like Tulsa. We had a sad Tulsa, and of course, it's not in the history books, but there are records, and we are digging into that. And one of the things is we're trying to visualize the history that has been invisibilized. And all that becomes like a slow cooker for social unrest, for crime, for hatred. Oh, Mariela is coming back. For hatred. And those are the main consequences, aside from, again, the elephant in the room, the pain that we all have inside, the intergenerational trauma that we have been hosting inside us. And again, it's the elephant in the room. No one talks about it, not even us. My grandfather never talked about his origin. Although we knew it, it was something that was under the carpet. And I have the personal mission to come out and put out all my genetic traits that I am aware of. Chinese is one that I, of course, love. I love them all, but not the only. Okay, and we're moving from the social to the personal. I'm sorry. Please, Alexandra.
Yeah, okay, the consequence, if we talk about arts and literature, is the lack of visibility of Chinese descendants production and the way it was ignored in the construction of the canon. Of course, nowadays we in humanities question the notion of the canon, but decades ago, the introduction of one book in this list was enough to remain it visible over the decades. Because of this lack of citizenship of Tusan literature, it was not possible for the rest of Peruvians to think of Chinese descendants as a living community, made up of people who are part of Peruvian society, culture, and territory. In other words, Tusan community was reduced to architecture and places, such as the Barrio Chino, or the Chinese neighborhood, the chifas, or Chinese restaurants, and the material objects that we can find inside them, such as the waving lucky cat, the statue of Sun deity, and the aquarium with the goldfish, and obviously the food. Because of this reduction of our legacy, there was an invisibilization of the bodies that make up the Tusan community. Also, because of the desire of acceptance of our community in Peruvian society, we reduce ourselves as the image of entrepreneurs, good citizens that adapted themselves to the logic of the capital and are an example of entrepreneurship. Sorry, the pronunciation was awful.
That was clear, don't worry.
Yeah, well, it was clear, the idea. That's important. For other communities. This was common, especially in the 90s, when Alberto Fujimori was president and when the Wong family emerged as an example of overcoming and economic success in times of social, political, and economic crisis. They owned one of the biggest chain of supermarkets in Lima that is called Wong, and that was targeted to the upper middle class consumers and emulated the way supermarkets were in first world countries, such here in the United States. I think that part of their success upon the upper middle classes is because it emulated the desire of being outside of the country, living in other first world countries, and with more opportunities and less crisis. Yeah, this is something that I'm taking sort of from the chapter that Julia wrote with Andrea and also Valerie. This idea of the entrepreneurship is from Valerie. I'm citing her.
Yeah, what I would add to what you just said, Alexandra, is that even in the idea of the model minority, the Tusan identity, Nikkei identity is othered, right? And regarding the notion of citizen security, the system has clear consequences on the livelihoods of people, their quality of lives, and the way they experience their citizenship and their role in the nation itself. Further, we have other systems like the centrality of economic, political, and social opportunities that are also at the root of this widened inequality gaps and security concerns felt and lived by different groups of people. How some communities interact with the state and policy enforcement, for instance, is completely different according to where they are located. And these dynamics are also influenced by the social narratives that we hold about these groups. And for society at large, as Alexandra was saying, is also the erasure of the many voices and rationalities and culture and literature and everything that actually makes us Peruvian, right? So the consequences are huge and endless, but that's why these amazing women are studying this and writing about these things.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and thank you all for your terrific elaboration on those points. But I guess one of the questions I'd love to ask is, so how do you think all the lessons that have been learned by successive Peruvian governments over the past 100 years can help nations across the world? And I list, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. All those countries have, indigenous populations. They all have very high levels of migration too. So you have a real melting pot of cultures that, that characterize Australia, New Zealand, Canada. I'm just using those countries just as examples. But how can we ensure that ethnic and cultural diversity is preserved and embraced in those nations?
Well, I would start saying that I'm a bit saddened to say that no, the planet is still learning the lesson. I'm not going to say it has not learned it, because I think it's a work in progress and we can still learn. I'm just going to take as an example Canada, where I live. It's a country I love. I live here, it's my home, I'm Peruvian Canadian. And because I love Canada, I have to also say what I see, what is going on. You might have seen it in the news. Canada is working in its reconciliation with Indigenous. And in the middle of what was a nice pathway, these cadavers start emerging in the different properties, the premises of the Indigenous residential schools since last May, right? Started 215 and then 95 recently and 100 and something earlier. It's been a rocky year of discovering that. So the idea of these schools was kill the savage, save the men, take the Indian away. Oh, wow, that line is extremely powerful. It's just spine chilling. Then that's why we say that we're still learning. The other issue that Canada is working on is the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which are, it's sad to say, is women in reproductive age, one, by one disappear and show up, if they show up long time later, dead. So that's an inquiry that the country is working to. And while we have tears in our heart when we say this, it's still good to see that there are sectors in the population working for that equality, for that discovery, to reach truth, healing, and reconciliation, because without seeing the truth of what happened, there cannot be closure in the soul of people, in the soul of the country. Therefore, there will not be reconciliation. So it's saddened and it's somber to look at the past and to see that it's still there. But it's hopeful that there's voices and hearts pushing towards the truth and the growing together and towards a real inclusion that embrace these truths as part of the past for them not to happen again. And just one line, the government has set up, and this is very nice, has set up therapy and counseling avenues that are free, available 24/7 for anybody that feels that needs, because they are survivors, they know survivors, they heard stories, or they just want to voice out of it. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, I think that we should take into account that in Peruvian society or Peru as a country, we didn't have this open policy of killing indigenous or foreigner communities. We had it in the 90s, obviously. I don't try to deny it, but we didn't have this open policy that that, for example, Argentina had at the beginning of the 20th century, Chile had, so they did like all their population the same, right? So that's what thing that I think that we should take into account if we want to understand why we have this problem right now, in quotes, why we have this thing that we don't know how to think about our identity, how to approach about this topic of our diversity in our own culture. One strategy I think that these communities, mainly Chinese communities, had in order to be part of Peruvian society is the one from the logic of capital. They insert in Peruvian society as entrepreneurship in order to be accepted by this society. Luckily, I think that nowadays we as a community, we're questioning this unique way of introducing ourselves, and we even question the very logic of capitalism because it is based on colonialist models. And I think because of that we try to introduce ourselves to society in other ways, such as in the academic production, the arts, literature, and philosophy. Yeah, honestly, this question was very difficult for me because it's not from a artistic perspective, but yeah, I think that maybe I said something from my point of view, from arts and literature.
Mariela, you have something to add?
Yes, I'm sorry, my internet was going away. I did wanted to say something to what Alexandra just said, because I think that we don't have that active policy today, right? But the scenario is there for impunity to happen when these things come about. And it is really precisely in the otherness of these communities and how we don't see them as equal or on the same level of citizenship that we have in different parts of the country, right? I think that one of the main takeaways that we can have, or that we can extract from these processes, is to do a better work at shying away from declarative multiculturality or even interculturality if the efforts are going to focus only on the formal measures, and bet instead on cultural affirmation. Coming out of the Third World Conference Against Racism and following the regional trend, we, Peru, declare ourselves as multicultural. Yet what we know now is that if those sentiments are not accompanied by the affirmation of cultures, the highlight of how important they are on and by themselves and how much value they hold, the discourse becomes empty. You're even met, and Julia and Alexandra, we know this, you're even met with dissenting voices that deny the value or that they don't understand the sudden need to uphold diversity, right? So there is an imperative to go beyond the discourse of diversity and multiculturality and actually implement a wide strategy of cultural affirmation first and foremost. I think that would be one of the main takeaways of, or one of the main lessons of this processes going around the world.
Thank you very much. And finally, Mariela, we understood that you are the editor of the book, Más allá del Bicentenario. Would you please share with us what are the criteria or drivers of the book? And if we could learn what are the contents of the book and what contribution or gap is the book expected to fulfill?
Sure, absolutely. I am very, very excited for this book, and I really welcome the opportunity to talk about it. This is the first space where I'm actually talking about the book. My main objective was to provide the reader with a diverse array of perspectives to better understand the socio-political scenario of the country. And now I know that that's the objective of every political science book written about Peru. That, that is clear. But what makes this one special is not only that it actually focused mainly on a list of topics that can be considered more nuanced or part of soft politics, but also that it includes the voices of peoples we do not normally hear about. And with that, I mean, of course, there is a chapter exploring if the Constitution should be changed and another one on the institutions, right? But with that, we also have one inquiring if we can call ourselves a fully formed nation. Another one on the aging population and how important it is to provide adequate care for them as a matter of public health. We have a chapter on LGBTQ citizenship, we have a chapter on domestic workers and controlling images. We have a chapter on religion and politics, right? And to the second point, I wanted to make sure that civil society was not only an uncredited source of knowledge production, but actually the one producing the knowledge, as they do every day. So people on the ground is also writing themselves on the page. We have La Colectiva writing 2 chapters about the Tusan experience. We have a young women organization writing about their process of organizing. We have a Black and an Indigenous organization writing about racism and their social standing as they see it. We have an LGBT organization writing about the space they hold in the labor market. And all of them writing along young and more established academics in the same playing field at the same level. It has been an amazing project to coordinate, and I'm eager for everybody to be able to read it and have access to it. My final goal for this book is to, at best, generate or at least inform a public debate about some of the topics that we don't talk about when we analyze Peruvian social and political dynamics, and at least for it to add to the conversation where the conversation is being held. The audience, of course, is not only academia, but politicians, civil society, and the public at large.
Looks like I'm going to have to put my order in and get that book. Fantastic. But look, that wraps up our discussion for today. Many thanks to Julia, Mariela, and Alexandra for your time. It's very much appreciated. Now, please make sure you subscribe to our YouTube page. Simply type ITSS Verona into your search box and check us out online as well at www.itssverona.it. And lastly, we're on social media, so also follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram to keep up to date with our latest articles and podcasts. So on behalf of Sofia and I, thank you so much for listening, and we sincerely hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.